Hi there, Kate Bora and Fiona Pearman joining you for this week's live, where we're continuing our conversation around office politics. And I think where we want to go today is really thinking about the role that office politics plays in driving organisational culture, and particularly a culture that's very exclusionary rather than one that's inclusive of everybody.
Yeah, I think by definition, because office politics is full of secrets, hidden rules, there's non-disclosure, there's behaviours that tend to leave some people out, we are already excluding people. Just the nature of office politics does this. There's an in-group, there's people who know how to play the game and perhaps are perpetuating it because they've benefited from it. So the bias tends to be reinforced. And I think what we see is that if we allow that culture of office politics to be the dominant one, equity is almost certainly going to suffer. And we're going to ensure that promotions opportunities tend to go to those people who are politically savvy, who are well connected, and very often marginalised groups, which can often include people with difference. It can be women, it can be culturally diverse, it can be, introverts. They tend to get excluded.
Yeah, I think on some level, just the definition of office politics, right, goes against the idea of all the conversations we have around what it means to have an inclusive culture. So I think it's a really interesting conversation for organizations and leaders to actually stare into what office politics is, how it operates in their organization, the costs, the benefits, and there are both. And I think as leaders, we have an opportunity to be able to shape the system, right? Whether we intend to or not, how we engage in office politics, how we navigate it will reinforce a lot of the accepted behaviours around what's okay, what's not okay. And so we've got an opportunity to acknowledge and bring awareness around that. And of course, then to shift cultures around the role it has with regards to power and influence as well.
Yeah, I think if we want to address this, if we want to deal with it, we've got to look into it. We've got to be willing to face the current dynamics. And, one of our first systemic principles is acknowledge what is. Look at what's going on. Once we're able to see that, and maybe the vulnerability of recognizing how we personally have benefited, may be one of the first steps to being able to talk about this, to open it up and think about how we've used office politics potentially to navigate the system. And look, we talked quite a lot about this in the previous video. So we'll put a link to that because there's a whole lot of pieces about having to work with the system we're in. And as Kate said, from a leadership point of view, what are the things we can start to do to try and counter this and try and foster a bit more inclusivity rather than exclusivity?
Yeah, I think, talking openly about power and influence, demystifying it, and probably really being brave around this as well. The mere nature of office politics is there's a lot that's hidden, that's not communicated, that isn't transparent. And so there'll be a lot of fears going on underneath some of this stuff. And possibly, I think it's for all of us, particularly if we have worked in highly political dynamics where we've had to navigate systems, possibly some shame too, in terms of how maybe we don't feel like we've had a choice, right? If you want to survive in some systems, you do have to engage in those as well. And so actually having some courageous conversations, with ourselves firstly, but also with each other, it can be really useful. I think when we start to think about driving more inclusion or inclusive conversations, really starting to think about who's missing from key conversations, who's not present, communicating quite overtly around how and why decisions are made. And again, I think this is a really interesting one for organisations to lean into around how transparent they are about decision making, or actually how, in some cases, they're not very transparent and they actually are quite secretive about decision making in organisations.
Yeah, I think being willing to examine is really important here. What we know is that if you start to notice places where potentially decision making is opaque or it's unclear how we got to that, or perhaps you see that, there are certain groups that are discussing things and people are being left out, or you notice some back channeling. Whenever we are aware of that, there's an opportunity to get curious. And we really love that frame because rather than accusing people of doing the wrong thing or of intentionally excluding others, if we get curious, we can start to ask, we can gently point out ways in which maybe inadvertently holding on to the old ways of doing things, following those informal rules, are leaving some people out. They're actually meaning that some of those groups are just overlooked and they're unseen, invisible because of our bias towards the in-group, which tends to happen in quite a political environment. And I think the opportunity from that is potentially to start to hold people accountable, to start to question, again, in a way that's not accusing or blaming so much as questioning and saying, are we getting the results we want here? Or is there another way we could go about it? What are the things we could potentially do differently that would include more rather than mean that some people are excluded or left out?
Yeah, and I think the only other piece I'd add here is, apart from how you navigate the office politics and influence the culture, it can be really useful to have these conversations with your team, to resource them in video through. We talk a lot about that, to resource them around how to navigate the system as it stands, or the office politics as it stands right now, so that they can feel more resourced, so that their well-being can be strengthened. Because there's no question that some of the costs, and we see it with many of the women we coach, some of the impact on people personally through the experience of feeling excluded, some of the stuff that goes on for them, the consequences can be really significant in terms of workplace health and safety and well-being.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity here when if we want to drive this less toxic, less politically overt culture, is how do we include, how do we have more clarity? How do we create ethical influence rather than this kind of shadowy, unseen, hidden influence? And we know that leaders who are willing to look at this and prioritize openness, when they make decisions transparent, when they start to model some of that accountability, maybe that reflection and looking at ways in which I've benefited, they will set a new tone in the workplace. And that tone, that willingness to do that, that opens up a culture of more fairness, more trust, and one of more shared power.
We're going to leave it there. If you've enjoyed today's confidence conversation and you know someone in your network who'd benefit from them, we'd love, of course, for you to share that with them. If you'd like to see more of these confidence conversations, head over and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hundreds of videos, including this series on office politics, over there for you to access. And also, a ton of our clients who have been part of our Acts of Confidence program, sharing the impact of our work on their career and life. And if and when you're ready to go deeper with your relationship with core confidence, visit our website, coreconfidence.com.au.